sound started around 10:30. A low, rhythmic scraping, like boot leather dragging against wet stone. It came from inside the tunnel. The two maintenance workers standing at the Marsden portal heard it clearly. They had been sent to inspect the brickwork lining in the spring of 1983, and they had done this job before. Standage Tunnel was 3 miles long, cut straight through the Pennine Hills, and it had been closed to commercial traffic for decades. There was no one inside. There was no boat. There was no reason for the sound. One of them shone his torch into the entrance. The beam died after 40 feet. Beyond that, nothing. Just the dark and the wet, and the sound of something pushing against the walls, moving closer in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The rhythm of legs walking a boat through a tunnel that had not carried a boat in years. He turned the torch off. They stood there in the quiet. The scraping stopped. Then it resumed, farther away, moving back into the tunnel as though whatever had been approaching had changed its mind. Neither man entered the tunnel that morning. The inspection was rescheduled. My name is Joel. I find old accounts of things that happened to working people in dangerous places, things that were left out of official records and never spoken of again. If you've got a story of your own, the link to submit it is in the description. And if you want more of these, subscribing is the best way to make that happen. In the report filed with the Canal Authority, the delay was attributed to water levels. That account was shared by a volunteer with the Huddersfield Canal Society in the early 2000s, repeated from what the maintenance crew had told colleagues. No official documentation of the incident has been found, but it matched something that had been said about that tunnel for over 150 years, that the men who died inside it never stopped working. Between 1794 and 1811, roughly 2,500 men carved Standage Tunnel through solid Pennine rock using hand tools and black powder. At least 50 of them died during construction. Some historians put the number significantly higher. No complete record of casualties was kept. In the decades that followed, a second kind of worker entered the tunnel. The legger, a man who lay on his back across a wooden plank on the bow of a narrowboat and walked the vessel through the darkness by pressing his feet against the tunnel walls, one step at a time, for over 3 miles. Some of those men were crushed to death between the hull and the stone. Their names, in most cases, were never recorded. In Ohio, along the Miami and Erie Canal, a 5-year-old boy fell into the water in the 1860s and drowned while his dog tried to pull him out. Within days, the dog was lying on the boy's grave and would not leave. Within years, people were seeing the boy and the dog walking the cemetery at night, and they have not stopped being seen since. And on the old towpaths and rail corridors of central New York, where the Erie Canal reshaped an entire landscape, a woman in a hoop skirt has been reported walking the tracks for over a century. On at least one occasion, a locomotive crew claims she appeared directly on the rails ahead of their engine, running faster than any person should be able to run, and that by the time they brought the train to a full stop, she was gone, and they were 20 feet from the edge of a bridge that was no longer there. These are the stories that grew in the margins of the Canal era. And to understand why they grew there, you need to understand what that era was. Canal building in the 18th and 19th centuries was one of the most physically punishing forms of labor in the English-speaking world. In Britain, the men who dug the canals were called navvies, short for navigators, a term that originally referred to the workers on the early navigation channels and stuck long after the work had moved to railways and roads. In America, canal crews were drawn from local farm labor, immigrant populations, and, in the southern states, enslaved people. The work was the same everywhere. You dug, you hauled, you stood in water that came to your thighs and swung a pickaxe until your shoulders burned, and then you swung it again. You breathed limestone dust and black powder smoke. You slept in shanty camps that flooded in the rain and froze in the winter. You ate what was available, which was often not much. Cholera, typhus, and malaria killed canal workers at rates that rivaled battlefield casualties. Along the Erie Canal alone, thousands of laborers died of disease during the construction years between 1817 and 1825. Many were buried in unmarked graves beside the very channels they had been digging. The conditions produced a particular kind of folklore. Not the folklore of farmsteads or fishing villages. Those traditions grow slowly over generations, shaped by seasons and repetition. Canal folklore grew fast and grew in transit. The workers moved from site to site. The canals cut through landscapes that had been untouched for centuries, through hills, or through wetlands, through ground that local communities had long avoided for reasons they did not always articulate clearly. The navvies and the laborers brought their own beliefs with them: Irish Catholicism, Welsh chapel superstition, the folk traditions of the English Midlands, the spiritual practices of enslaved Africans, and those beliefs collided with the strangeness of the work itself. You were digging into the earth. You were rerouting water. You were building tunnels through mountains where no tunnel had been. And at the end of it, you had created a new kind of landscape, miles of still, dark water running through places where water had never been, connected by channels that ran underground for distances the human mind struggled to hold. The canals themselves became liminal spaces, not quite river, not quite road, not quite natural, not quite built. They sat in the landscape like long, quiet wounds, and the folklore that gathered around them had the same quality, not quite ghost story, not quite history, something in between. I came to these accounts through a footnote, a single line in a heritage survey document for the Huddersfield Narrow Canal, published in the early 1990s, that mentioned persistent reports of unexplained phenomena within the Standedge Tunnel complex, predating the 1980s restoration period. That was all it said. The footnote cited no source, but it was enough to start pulling on, and what came back was stranger and more varied than I had expected. The first account takes us to the West Riding of Yorkshire, to a tunnel that took 17 years to build and has never stopped being dark. A Standedge tunnel sits beneath the moors between the villages of Marsden and Diggle on the border of what is now West Yorkshire and Greater Manchester. It runs for 5,210 yards, just under 3 miles, through the millstone grid of the Pennine Hills. When it was completed in 1811, it was the longest, highest, and deepest canal tunnel in Britain. It still holds those records today. Construction began in 1794 under the direction of the Huddersfield Narrow Canal Company. The engineer was Benjamin Outram, later replaced by Thomas Telford's associate Nicholas Brown, after Outram's initial designs proved insufficient for the geology. The Pennines at that point are hard stone, gritstone and shale, layered and fractured, laced with underground springs. The plan was to cut a tunnel wide enough for a single narrowboat, roughly 9 feet across and roughly 7 feet high, through the full width of the hills. There would be no towpath inside the tunnel. The dimensions did not allow for one. 2,500 navvies were employed over the 17-year construction period, though not all at once. Work proceeded from both ends simultaneously, with additional vertical shafts sunk from the moor above to allow crews to work multiple faces. The tools were picks, shovels, hand drills, and gunpowder. Progress was measured in feet per week. Some weeks, through the hardest stone, they gained less than a yard. The men lived in camps on the moor and in the villages at either end. Marsden and Diggle were small communities. The arrival of hundreds and sometimes thousands of navvies, many of them Irish, many of them itinerant, most of them young and single, transformed the area. There were fights, there were epidemics, there were accidents underground that killed men in ways that were not always recorded with precision. A tunnel collapse, a premature detonation, a fall down a shaft. The official death toll during construction is listed as around 50, but local historians have argued for years that the real number was higher. Parish burial records from Marsden show spikes in interments during the construction years that are not fully accounted for by the official project records. What those men experienced underground, the work itself, deserves a moment. The tunnel had no natural light, none. Either from the moment you passed beyond the first curve of the entrance, you were in absolute darkness. The only illumination came from candles or oil lamps mounted on the boat or carried by hand. The air was damp. In some sections, water ran down the walls in sheets. In others, it pooled on the tunnel floor and had to be pumped out before work could continue. The temperature underground was cold but not freezing, a steady chill that settled into your joints and stayed. The sounds carried strangely. A pick striking rock at one face could be heard, distorted, hundreds of yards away. Voices echoed and overlapped. The drip of water was constant and, after enough hours, maddening. And then, once the tunnel was finished, the leggers arrived. Legging was the method used to move narrowboats through canal tunnels that had no towpath. It was common across the British canal network in the 19th century, used at dozens of tunnels, but Standage was the longest stretch by a considerable margin. At other tunnels, Blisworth, Harecastle, Netherton, legging might take an hour. At Standage, it took 3 to 4 hours, sometimes longer depending on water conditions. The process worked like this. The horse that had been towing the boat along the canal would be unhitched at the tunnel entrance and walked over the top of the hill by a boy or a handler, following a path across the moor to meet the boat at the other end. Meanwhile, the boat would enter the tunnel. 2 men, sometimes crew members, sometimes professional leggers hired for the purpose, would lie on their backs on wooden planks set across the bow of the narrowboat. Their shoulders rested on the planks. Their legs extended upward and outward, feet pressing flat against the tunnel walls. And then they walked, one foot then the other, pushing against the damp stone, inching the fully loaded boat forward through the dark. Think about the geometry of that for a moment. You are lying on your back. Your head is inches from the waterline. Above you is the hull of the boat, the plank, and then the tunnel ceiling, close enough to touch, in most places close enough that sitting up would crack your skull. To your left and right, the tunnel walls press in. The boat fills nearly the full width of the channel. The gap between the hull and the wall is, in places, less than a foot. Your legs are extended into that gap, your feet braced against wet stone. If the boat drifts, if your partner pushes harder on one side, if the load shifts, if the current changes, the hull swings toward the wall, and you are between them, your legs, your hips, your ribs. Men were crushed this way. The boat would drift, or one legger would lose his footing on the slick wall, and the gap would close before either man could pull free. In 3 miles of absolute darkness, there was no room to roll away and no one to call for help except your partner on the other plank, who was in the same position you were, and the boatman somewhere behind you in the dark, who could do nothing but listen. Professional leggers at Standage were paid by the trip. The rate was modest. The work was exhausting and dangerous, and the men who did it were, by most accounts, the kind of men who had no better option. Some were former navvies who had stayed in the area after construction ended, and some were laborers from the local mills. Some were simply men who needed money and had strong legs. Their names, in the overwhelming majority of cases, were not recorded. They were paid in cash at the tunnel mouth. They do not appear in company ledgers by name. When they died, and they died, their deaths were sometimes noted in parish records as drownings or crushing injuries, sometimes not noted at all. The tunnel was in active commercial use from 1811 until 1921, when narrowboat traffic ceased. That is 110 years of leggers working in the dark, 110 years of men lying on their backs and pushing boats through 3 miles of stone with their feet. Some of them died inside, and the stories say that some of them are still there. It's the accounts of strange phenomena inside Standage Tunnel span at least a century and a half. They cluster into a few recurring categories. The first and most persistent is sound. Specifically, the sound of legging, the rhythmic scraping of feet against stone, heard inside the tunnel at times when no boat was present. This has been reported by canal maintenance workers, by volunteers involved in the restoration of the Huddersfield Narrow Canal in the 1980s and 1990s, and by visitors to the tunnel after it was reopened for guided boat trips in 2001. The descriptions are remarkably consistent. A slow, steady rhythm. 2 sets of feet alternating. The sound of boot leather on wet gritstone. It comes from deeper inside the tunnel, beyond the reach of any torch or lamp, and it moves. Sometimes it approaches, sometimes it recedes. It does not respond to shouts or other noise. One account from the restoration period describes a work crew that entered the tunnel from the Diggle end to assess the condition of the brickwork lining. They were approximately 500 yards inside when they heard the scraping begin. It was ahead of them, in the section of tunnel they had not yet reached. They stopped and listened. The sound continued for approximately 2 minutes, then ceased. When they advanced to the section where the sound had seemed to originate, they found the tunnel empty. The water was still. There was no wake, no disturbance, no indication that a boat had been present. One of the workers later said that what disturbed him most was not the sound itself, but the rhythm. It was too regular to be accidental, too steady, too measured. It was the rhythm of a man working. The second category is visual. Lights have been reported inside the tunnel, faint, yellowish, moving slowly at water level as though carried on a boat. These have been seen from both portals and from inside the tunnel itself. In several accounts, the light appears to move in the direction that a boat being legged would travel, at approximately the speed a legged boat would move. Witnesses who have attempted to approach the lights report that they recede, maintaining their distance until they extinguish or round a curve that, in the geometry of a straight tunnel, should not exist. And then there is the figure. Multiple reports spanning decades describe a robed or cloaked figure seen inside the tunnel, unusually standing motionless in the channel or on the narrow ledge that runs along one wall in certain sections. The descriptions vary. Some say the figure is tall, some say it is stooped, some say it appears to be wearing something that might be a coat or a cloak or a shroud. In every account, the figure is seen at the extreme edge of visibility, at the limit of torchlight or lamplight, and in every account, when the observer moves closer, the figure is gone. Not receding, not fading. Gone as though it had never been there. This is where the accounts take a turn that moves beyond the expected territory of ghost stories. In the 1980s, during the early stages of the Canal restoration project, workers entering the tunnel began finding things that did not belong there. The first reports were of animal remains, a sheep's head, sheep placed on a ledge in the tunnel wall, chicken heads arranged in a pattern on the brickwork. These were not the remnants of predation or decay. They had been placed deliberately. The cuts were clean, the arrangements were intentional. Then the symbols appeared, painted onto the tunnel walls in what appeared to be red and black paint, or possibly something else. Workers found markings that they described as occult in nature, pentagrams, circles with symbols inside them, characters that none of the workers recognized. These were not near the tunnel entrances where vandals or teenagers might easily reach. They were deep inside, a mile in or more, in sections accessible only by boat or by a long, difficult walk through shallow water in total darkness. Someone had gone to considerable effort to put them there. The most disturbing discovery was made in a large natural cavern that opens off the main tunnel bore approximately midway through the hill. This cavern, which is significantly larger than the tunnel itself, tall enough to stand in, wide enough to echo, had long been known to canal workers and was referred to locally as the cathedral. Inside the cathedral, a former police officer from the Kirklees division reported finding a large pentagram painted high on the wall, well above head height. Reaching it would have required either a ladder brought in by boat or climbing the cavern's rock face. Beneath it, on a natural stone shelf, were the remains of candles and what appeared to be burnt offerings. The Canal Authority acknowledged the discoveries. Local police investigated. No suspects were identified. The symbols and remains were cleaned away during the restoration work. But the question they raised has never been satisfactorily answered. Not the question of who put them there, but the question of why there. Why that tunnel? Why that specific cavern deep inside a hill, miles from any road, accessible only through absolute darkness? What about that place drew people to it, not once, but repeatedly, over what appeared to be an extended period? The workers who found these things did not, by most accounts, connect them directly to the older stories of ghost leggers and strange lights. They were two separate categories of unsettling, one supernatural, one human, both rooted in the same 3 miles of darkness. But some of the volunteers and historians involved in the restoration have noted something that is difficult to dismiss entirely. The cathedral sits in the approximate center of the tunnel. It is the largest open space inside the hill, and it is the section of the tunnel from which the legging sounds are most frequently reported, the epicenter, if the accounts are mapped, of whatever it is that people have been hearing inside Standage for 150 years. The restoration was completed. The tunnel was reopened. Guided boat trips now run through it regularly, departing from the visitor center in Marsden. The trips are popular. The guides mention the ghosts. What the guides do not always mention is that the professional leggers who worked standage for over a century, the men who were crushed, the men who drowned, the men who spent their working lives lying on their backs in the dark, pushing boats through stone, were largely invisible even when they were alive. They do not appear in the company histories. Their wages were recorded as lump sums, not individual payments. When one died, another took his place at the tunnel mouth the next morning. The work continued. The boats moved through. The names were lost. The ghost leggers of standedge, if that is what they are, exist in a kind of double absence. They were unrecorded in life and unexplained in death. The sounds continue. The Canal Authority does not comment on them. The guided tours run during daylight hours and do not reach the cathedral. There is a detail from one account that has stayed with me since I first read it. A canal volunteer working inside the tunnel in the early 1990s described hearing the legging sound begin suddenly, very close, as though a boat had appeared just yards away in the dark. He turned his torch toward the sound. The beam illuminated the tunnel wall, the water, the low ceiling. Nothing was there. But in the moment before the sound stopped, he said he felt something else, a displacement of air, a faint pressure against his chest, as though something large had just passed him in the narrow channel. The air moved. The water did not. He finished his work and left the tunnel. In the logbook at the Marsden end, he wrote the time of his exit and the section he had inspected. He did not write anything about the sound or the air. When asked about it years later, he said he had not known what to write. There was no column in the logbook for it. There was no category. There was no word. The tunnel is still there. It runs beneath the moor between Marsden and Diggle, 3 miles of darkness, carrying water that barely moves. On quiet days, when no tour boat is scheduled, the portals stand open at both ends, and the sound of the wind across the moor does not enter. The air inside is still. The water is still. Nothing moves. That is what the maintenance workers say. Nothing moves. And then, sometimes something does. That was stone and darkness in the Pennine Hills. The next account takes us to a different kind of water and a different kind of grief. From a tunnel in England to a canal bank in Ohio, and from grown men hearing sounds they could not explain to a child who fell and a dog that would not leave. Dayton, Ohio, in the 1860s, York was a canal town. The Miami and Erie Canal ran through the city's heart, connecting Cincinnati to the south with Toledo and Lake Erie to the north. It was a working waterway, barges loaded with grain, lumber, and goods moving slowly through a system of locks and channels that defined the rhythm of commerce and daily life for communities along its entire 274-mile length. The canal was not fenced. It was not gated. It ran through neighborhoods, past houses, behind shops. Children played beside it the way children in other towns played beside creeks or rivers. The water was slow and often shallow near the banks, but the channel itself was deep enough to drown in, and drownings were not rare. They were a fact of canal life, the way cave-ins were a fact of mining life, known, mourned briefly, absorbed into the ongoing business of the town. A cobbler named Morehouse lived in Dayton with his family. His youngest son was called Johnny. The boy was 5 years old. He had a dog, a large, loyal animal that followed him everywhere. The breed is not recorded with certainty in the earliest accounts. Later tellings describe it as a mixed breed, or a hound, or something resembling a golden retriever, though this last description may be an artifact of the famous gravestone, rather than any reliable account of the living animal. What every account agrees on is the dog's devotion to the boy. They were inseparable. The dog slept at the boy's feet. It followed him to the canal bank. It was with him on the day he fell. The details of Johnny Morehouse's death are plain. He was playing near the canal. He fell in. The dog went in after him. The dog, tried to pull the boy to the bank. It failed. The boy drowned. Whether the dog pulled the body out of the water or whether other people arrived in time to do so varies by account. The outcome does not vary. A 5-year-old boy was dead, and his dog had tried to save him and could not. Johnny was buried in Woodland Cemetery, a large and well-established burial ground on the south side of Dayton. The cemetery had been founded in 1841, designed in the rural cemetery tradition, rolling hills, old-growth trees, winding paths. It was a place built for grief to have room. What happened next is where the folklore begins. And it begins with something that is not supernatural at all. It begins with a dog lying on a grave. Within days of the burial, people visiting the cemetery noticed the dog. It was lying on the freshly turned earth of Johnny's grave. It did not move when they approached. It did not leave when they left. It was still there the next day, and the next, and the day after that. The dog would not eat. It would not follow anyone home. It simply lay on the grave of the boy it had tried to save and waited. For what? No one could say. The people of Dayton, seeing this, began to bring the dog food and water. They left bowls beside the grave. The dog drank. It ate eventually, but it would not leave the spot. Days became weeks. Weeks became something longer. The dog lived on the grave. Whether the dog eventually died there or was finally coaxed away is a point where accounts diverge. Some say it stayed until it died. Some say it was eventually adopted by a cemetery worker but returned to the grave repeatedly. What is consistent across all versions is that the dog's vigil was real, was witnessed by many people, and was extended enough to become widely known in Dayton. The cobbler, moved by the animal's devotion, commissioned a new headstone for his son's grave. The work was done by a local stonecutter named Daniel Ladow. The result is remarkable and still stands in Woodland Cemetery today. It is a carved limestone sculpture showing a small boy lying asleep, or dead, curled against the body of a large dog. The dog is alert, head up, watchful, as if guarding the child even in stone. Around the boy are carved the objects of his short life: a cap, a ball, a top, a small harmonica. The craftsmanship is fine, the detail is precise, the boy's face is peaceful, the dog's is not. The dog's expression, if stone can have expression, is one of waiting. Not rest, not grief, readiness, as though something might still be required of it. That sculpture has stood in Woodland Cemetery for over 150 years, and in that time, the folklore that grew around it has moved well beyond the story of a faithful dog. The first reports of something unusual at the gravesite are difficult to date precisely. Oral tradition in Dayton places them in the late 19th century, within a generation of Johnny's death. People visiting the cemetery in the evening or at dusk began to report seeing a child in the grounds, a small boy, walking among the headstones, accompanied by a dog. The descriptions were consistent enough to draw attention, but vague enough to resist confirmation. A small figure, a larger shape beside it, moving at the pace of a walking dog, always at a distance, and always in fading light. When approached, the figures were not there. These sightings accumulated over decades. By the 20th century, they had become established local knowledge, the kind of thing longtime Dayton residents mentioned to newcomers as a matter of fact, not as a matter of belief. The boy and the dog walk the cemetery. Everyone knows this. Whether anyone you know personally has seen them is a different question, but someone always has a neighbor or a cousin or a coworker who saw them. The story passed from generation to generation with the steady, quiet persistence that marks the most durable kind of local folklore. Then, the sightings became harder to dismiss. On at least 2 documented occasions, Dayton police responded to calls from citizens reporting a small child alone in Woodland Cemetery after hours. The callers were concerned for the child's safety. It was dark. A child that young should not be in a cemetery alone. The police responded. They searched the grounds. They found no child, no footprints, no sign of anyone having been in the area. What they did find in both cases was the Morehouse grave, and the callers, when shown the gravestone, became quiet. The descriptions they had given of the child matched the sculpture. A small boy, a dog at his side. These police reports exist in oral tradition rather than in confirmed department records, but the consistency of the accounts, the detail about officers being shown the grave, about the callers' reactions, suggests a narrative that was, at minimum, well established among Dayton police by the mid-20th century. The cemetery staff, for their part, have acknowledged the stories without either confirming or denying them. Woodland Cemetery's historical materials mention the Morehouse grave as one of the most visited sites in the grounds. They do not elaborate on why. The accounts that are most difficult to set aside are the quieter ones, not the full apparitions, not the police calls, but the small encounters that people describe reluctantly, as if they are not sure they have the right to claim what they experienced. One visitor, walking through the cemetery alone near dusk, described seeing a dog on the road ahead. A large dog, golden or tawny, moving with the easy, purposeful gait of a dog that knows where it is going. The visitor stopped. The dog turned and looked at them. Not the casual glance of a stray, a direct, sustained look, the kind a dog gives someone it is assessing. Then the dog barked once, turned, and bounded off the road toward the older section of the cemetery. The visitor watched it leap. And at the point where the dog's feet should have struck the ground, the dog was not there. It did not land. It did not fade. It was simply absent from the place it should have been, and the road was empty, and the cemetery was quiet, and the visitor stood alone on the path in the last of the daylight. That account was shared online by a person who identified themselves as a local resident. It cannot be verified, but its details, the golden color, the direct look, the single bark, the vanishing at the moment of landing, echo elements found in other accounts spanning decades. The color of the dog, the way it looks at you, the bark, the disappearance that is not gradual but instantaneous, and as though the animal simply stepped out of the visible world. The grave itself has become a kind of shrine. Visitors leave offerings, toys mostly, small plastic figurines, stuffed animals, toy cars, coins, flowers, and dog treats, boxes of dog biscuits, bags of kibble, individual treats placed carefully at the base of the sculpture beside the stone dog's paws. These appear daily. They appear in all seasons. They appear even when the cemetery is formally closed. The groundskeeping staff collects them periodically. New ones appear within hours. No one has ever identified who leaves them. Not all of them, certainly. It is not one person. It is not an organized effort. It is something else, a slow but continuous expression of something that the people of Dayton feel toward a boy who drowned 160 years ago and a dog that would not leave his grave. There is a question that sits beneath this story, and it is not the question of whether Johnny Morehouse's ghost walks Woodland Cemetery. That is a question for the people who see him. The question that sits beneath it is simpler and harder. Why does this story persist? Not the ghost story, the original story, the boy and the dog, the canal, the drowning, the vigil. Why, of all the children who drowned in Ohio's canals, and there were many, there were so many, why is this the one that Dayton remembers? The answer may be the dog. Not the ghost dog, the real dog, the living animal that lay on a grave and refused to move. That detail, that single, verifiable, a non-supernatural fact, is what the entire folklore tradition is built on. The ghost sightings came later, the police calls came later, the offerings came later, but the dog came first. A real animal, doing a real thing that no one could explain or rationalize or categorize in a world where explanations and categories were what separated the living from the dead. The dog could not save the boy. It could not bring him back. It could not understand what had happened. All it could do was stay. And that, apparently, was enough to build 160 years of folklore on. Enough to generate ghost sightings and police reports and daily offerings of dog treats left at the feet of a stone animal. Enough to turn a drowning in a canal into something that a city carries with it, generation after generation, like a weight that does not diminish. The canal is gone now. The Miami and Erie was drained in stages through the early 20th century, replaced by roads and rail and the simple economics of faster transport. The channel that Johnny Morehouse fell into no longer exists. The water that took him is not there, but the grave is there. The sculpture is there. The toys and the treats are there every morning. And some evenings in the older section of Woodland Cemetery, near the headstones that date to before the Civil War, people still see a boy walking with his dog. They see them at a distance, in the low light, moving between the graves at the pace of a child who is not in a hurry. The boy does not call out. The dog does not bark. They walk together, and then they are not there, and the cemetery is quiet, and the light continues to fade. That story was born from a canal. So was the next. But where Johnny Morehouse's story is about grief and loyalty and a presence that will not leave, the story of Eliza O'Brien is about rage and motion and a presence that will not stop. The Erie Canal changed New York the way a river changes a landscape, not gradually, but in a single irreversible cut. It was completed in 1825, 363 miles from Albany to Buffalo, and within a decade it had redrawn the economic and social map of the entire northeastern United States. Towns that had been backwaters became hubs. Farms that had been subsistence operations became commercial enterprises. And the corridor it created, a long, narrow band of transformed land stretching from the Hudson River to Lake Erie, became one of the most heavily traveled passages in America. The canal brought money. It brought people. It brought disruption. Families that had lived in quiet rural communities for generations found themselves suddenly adjacent to a river of commerce, noise, and strangers. The towpaths that ran alongside the canal became roads of a kind, walked by mule drivers, canal workers, travelers, and anyone else who needed to move between towns without paying for passage. When the railroads came, they followed the canal corridor. The towpaths were joined by rail beds. The traffic increased. The quiet was gone. Eliza was born somewhere along this corridor, in the vicinity of the railroad towns east of Rochester before the Civil War. Her maiden name is not preserved in any account I have found. She came from a family of modest means, comfortable enough to give her an education and a sense of her own standing, not wealthy enough to protect her from what happened next. She married a man named O'Brien. The accounts describe him as dashing, which is the word the 19th century used for a man who was attractive and unreliable. Not long after the marriage, O'Brien left. He took a substantial portion of Eliza's money with him. Whether he departed by canal or by rail is not recorded. He simply went, leaving Eliza with less than she had started with and more anger than the conventions of the era allowed her to express. What Eliza did with that anger is what made her famous. She refused to ride the trains. The railroads, she declared, were operated by men, and men as a class had failed her. She would not give them her money. She would not sit in their cars. She would not be carried by their engines. She would walk. And she did. For years, accounts vary on how many, but the consensus places her walking career at decades. Eliza walked the rail and canal towpaths of central New York, from village to village, town to town. She wore the clothes of her former station, hoop skirts, full Victorian dress, the kind of garments that were spectacularly impractical for walking miles of unpaved towpath in all seasons. She became a known figure. People recognized her. Children pointed. Shopkeepers gave her food. She was, depending on who was describing her, eccentric, tragic, deranged, or heroic. The local press called her the wandering woman in hoop skirts. She walked in daylight and she walked at dusk. She walked in rain, and she walked in snow. She walked the towpaths that ran beside the canal, and she walked the rail beds that ran beside the towpaths. She walked past the villages where O'Brien might have gone, and she walked past the stations where she refused to stop. Her walking was not aimless. It had a route, a pattern, a territory. She owned the corridor the way a ghost owns a hallway, through repetition, through presence, through the simple refusal to be anywhere else. When she died, the date is uncertain, the location is uncertain, the cause is uncertain. She did not stop walking. The first reports of a woman on the tracks came from the rail corridor east of Rochester, near the town of Pittsford. Train crews on the Rochester to Canandaigua line reported seeing a figure on the tracks ahead, a woman dressed in old-fashioned clothes moving along the rail bed. The reports were initially treated as a safety concern. A person on the tracks was dangerous. Trains were dispatched to slow through certain sections. Crews were told to watch for trespassers, but the woman was never found. The trains slowed, the crews searched, and no one was on the tracks. The reports continued. The woman was always at a distance. She was always moving. She was always dressed in clothing that belonged to a previous century, and she was always gone by the time anyone reached the spot where she had been seen. Then the incident with the bridge happened. and the story of Eliza O'Brien moved from local curiosity to something harder to explain. A locomotive was running the line near Pittsford. The crew, the engineer, and the fireman saw a woman on the tracks ahead. She was running, not walking, not standing, running, moving down the center of the tracks in the same direction the train was traveling, her skirts billowing behind her. The engineer hit the brakes. The train began to slow, but the woman would not move off the tracks. She kept running, staying ahead of the train, maintaining a distance that should not have been possible for a person on foot, ahead of a locomotive that, even braking, was traveling at considerable speed. The train slowed. The woman ran. The engineer laid on the whistle. The woman did not react. She simply ran, her form growing clearer as the train decelerated, her clothing unmistakable now. Victorian dress, full skirt, the silhouette of a woman from another century, moving at a speed that defied her appearance. The train stopped. The woman was gone. Not receding down the tracks, not stepping aside into the brush. Gone. The tracks ahead were empty. The engineer and fireman climbed down from the cab. They walked forward along the tracks to the point where the woman had last been visible. They walked past it. They walked another 20 feet. And then they stopped. The bridge was out. The tracks ahead ran to the edge of a gap where a bridge had been, collapsed or removed or washed out, the accounts do not agree, and beyond the gap was open air and a drop to the ground below. The train had been headed directly for it. At the speed it had been traveling before the woman appeared, it would not have stopped in time. The crew stood at the edge and looked at the gap. They looked back at the stopped locomotive. They looked at the empty tracks between. There was no woman. There were no footprints. There was nothing on the tracks except the rails and the gravel and the growing awareness of what had almost happened and what had prevented it. That account has been retold in multiple forms across the last century and a half. The details shift: the location of the bridge, the specific rail line, the year. Some versions place it in the 1880s, some in the early 1900s. The core remains the same: a spectral woman in Victorian dress running ahead of a train, leading it to slow down, vanishing at the moment the danger was revealed. The Rochester to Canandaigua line was closed permanently around 1960. In the decades before its closure, reports of the woman on the tracks continued with a regularity that local residents came to accept as a feature of the landscape. She was seen at different points along the line. She was seen in different seasons. She was seen at night and she was seen at dawn. She was, by all accounts, always moving, always walking or running, never standing still. And here is the detail that distinguishes Eliza O'Brien from a standard ghost on the track story, of which there are hundreds across the American rail system. Eliza was not associated with a single location. She was not tied to the site of her death, because no one knows where she died. She was not tied to the site of a tragedy, because her tragedy was not a single event. It was a condition: a husband who left, a fortune taken, a lifetime of walking in anger through a landscape that had been built by men for men. She haunts a corridor, not a spot. She moves through it the way she moved through it in life, relentlessly, deliberately, in clothes that do not belong to the era, at a pace that does not belong to the body. The trains are gone now. The rail line is closed. The corridor has been converted in parts to walking trails and greenways, but the accounts have not entirely stopped. As recently as the early 2000s, people walking the old railbed near Pittsford have reported seeing a figure in the distance, dressed wrong for the weather, dressed wrong for the century, moving along the path ahead of them. Always ahead, always receding, never quite reachable. The line closed in 1960. The canal drained long before that. The towpaths that Eliza walked in life have been paved over or returned to forest, or turned into suburban parks where children ride bicycles on Saturday mornings. The landscape she knew is gone. The men she despised are gone. The trains she refused to ride are gone, but the walking has not stopped. And it occurs to me, reading these accounts one after another in the quiet of an archive reading room, that Eliza O'Brien may be the most honest ghost in American folklore. She is not a mystery. She is not a riddle. She is not a creature or a warning or a symbol. She is a woman who was wronged, and she walked, and she has not stopped walking, and the world has changed entirely around her, and she is not noticed because the world was never the point. The walking was the point. The anger was the point. And anger, unlike bridges and rail lines and canal water, does not require maintenance to persist. 3 stories, 3 canals, 3 kinds of haunting. In Standedge, the dead are still working. In Dayton, the dead are still grieving. On the old Erie corridor, the dead are still walking. The canals that created these stories are, in most cases, gone or diminished, drained, filled in, converted to other uses. The work that built them is finished. The workers who died doing it are beyond counting in many cases, their names lost, their graves unmarked, their injuries recorded as line items in company ledgers that have themselves been lost. But the stories remain. They remain because someone told them, and someone else remembered, and someone after that wrote them down or repeated them to a journalist or a folklorist or a volunteer with a Canal Heritage Society, who mentioned them in a newsletter that sat in a filing cabinet for 30 years before anyone read it again. The Canal era lasted roughly a century in both Britain and America, from the late 1700s to the late 1800s, and with a long tail of diminishing use stretching into the 20th century. In that time, thousands of miles of waterway were cut through the earth by hand. The men who did that work, and the women and children who lived beside it, who fell into it, who walked along it, left behind a body of folklore that is unlike any other. It is not the folklore of ancient places. It is not the folklore of wilderness or ocean or deep forest. It is the folklore of construction, of things that were built, and the strangeness that moved in once the building was done. As though the act of cutting a channel through the ground opened something that was not a channel, as though the water, once admitted, carried more than barges. Standedge Tunnel is open for guided tours. The trips run from April to October. The boats are electric now. They move through the darkness in near silence, and the guides speak in low voices, and the torchlight plays across walls that were cut by hand over 200 years ago. The guides mention the ghosts. They mention the leggers. They do not mention the cathedral or what was found inside it. Woodland Cemetery in Dayton is open daily. The Morehouse grave is in the older section on a low rise near a stand of trees. The stone sculpture is worn by weather but intact. The boy sleeps against the dog. The toys accumulate at the base. The dog treats appear and are cleared and appear again. The old rail corridor near Pittsford is a walking trail now. It runs through wooded stretches and open fields, following the grade where the tracks used to be. On clear evenings when the light is going, you can see a long way down the trail in either direction. Most evenings there's nothing to see, just the path and the trees, and the light fading over what used to be a canal and is now just a long, quiet depression in the earth where water once moved and no longer does. Most evenings, there is nothing to see. The people who walk that trail will tell you that. They will also tell you, if you ask the right way and wait long enough for the answer, that most is not the same as all.